The air was thick with tension as the villagers gathered outside the church. Agnes Dave, a woman with a sharp tongue and a quick temper, stood at the center of the crowd, her voice cutting through the stillness. That woman, the preacher's wife, was a ledger in Goring's troop, a harlot. She spat, her words dripping with malice. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others whispering in disapproval. This was not the first time such accusations had been hurled, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In the late 1640s, the role of clergy wives was still uncertain, making them easy targets for verbal abuse. The focus was often sexual, and the insults came from all corners of the community, even from other women. In 1658, Johane Hilborne refused to attend church, claiming that Marjorie, the minister John Evans' wife, roared like a roaring bull when she sang psalms. It was a brutal and humiliating claim, one that Marjorie could do little to defend herself against. But it wasn't just the clergy wives who faced such treatment. The clergy themselves were often the targets of fierce and violent abuse. In 1655, Michael Rayner, a yeoman from Birdham in West Sussex, attacked the minister William Serjeant, calling him a hypocrite and threatening to have him hanged. The words were harsh, the threats real. Rayner was brought before the quarter sessions, but the damage was already done. The community was divided, and the tensions were palpable. In Amersley, Worcestershire, the situation escalated into physical violence. Walter Moyle, during a meeting to elect church officers, spat in the face of the minister William Harwell, calling him a rascally knave and cavaliering rouge. He didn't stop there. He threatened to have Harwell put in the stocks and to sequester anyone who supported him. The air was thick with anger and a sense of impending chaos. The Civil War had turned many people, especially women, into fierce and vocal opponents. In 1645, Anne Shefford of Asheldham, accused of causing a violent altercation, ran at the minister who tried to calm her, shouting, "Hang, hang, hang." The minister, trying to maintain order, was met with a storm of fury. In Horsham, Sussex, Joan Smith's anger reached a boiling point. Sitting in Robert Treadcroft's porch, she threw black dirt at Edward Houghton, a clerk, and wished for him to have a child with two heads. It was a cruel and ominous threat, drawing on the contemporary belief that monstrous births were a sign of God's punishment for religious opponents. The language of abuse was often brutal, with threats of execution, roasting alive, and even more violent acts. In Sandon, a churchwarden was threatened with having his flesh pulled from his bones. The violence wasn't limited to words. It was real and physical. In 1659, at a gathering of ministers in Lydiard, St. Lawrence, George Keane threatened to set the church on fire and cut off Agnes Stodden's head for assisting them. The fear was palpable, and the threats were taken seriously. Religious extremists like the early Quakers often led the charge. Sybil Bryant, a widow, repeatedly disrupted services at Inglesham Church in Wiltshire, once even brandishing an iron cleaver. The Cheshire Quakers were particularly aggressive, waiting outside churchyards to accost ministers and conducting their own noisy services in the churchyard, disturbing the congregation. The responses from the congregations were often just as belligerent. In Hackness, Yorkshire, in 1652, a mutiny broke out, and in Frodsham, Cheshire, in 1654, the situation turned violent. In Shepton Mallet, Somerset, in 1656, and at Midsummer Norton in 1658, the conflicts continued, each more intense than the last. The Bristol authorities tried to suppress these tumults, instructing ministers to avoid disputes and to persuade the disruptors to go home. But the problems persisted. In Barthomley, Cheshire, in 1654, the pastor John Smith faced a hubbub when Alexander Lawrence and others disrupted the service, leading to a collection for a poor man being interrupted. Lawrence accused Smith of preaching false doctrine, suggesting he was a Quaker, but 147 other parishioners also complained, accusing Smith of lying and being greedy for tithes. These were typical Quaker insults, but Smith called them desperate cavaliers. The fear of anarchy was a driving force behind the restoration of Charles II. But ironically, the years between 1660 and 1662 saw some of the worst incidents. A horse was baptized in Radcliffe Church in Cheshire, and Samuel Stileman, an ejected minister in Farnham, Surrey, held the church by force with the help of 2 cobblers and a bodice maker. In December 1660, Ellis Rowlands, the rector of Clonogfawr in Caernarfonshire, was prevented from entering the church and had to hold a service in the porch, where he was physically thrown around. In Devon, in May 1661, people ran through the streets at midnight, armed with swords, pistols, clubs, staves, axes, and pikes. They tore the Book of Common Prayer at Ottery St. Mary, and set a maypole in the stocks at Thorncombe. Robert Payne of Backwell, Somerset, reported spitting blood for days after being beaten up and thrown headfirst on the ground while trying to collect tithes in August 1661. These violent incidents were not just a continuation of old problems. They were a reflection of a society deeply divided and scarred by war. The language was more brutal, the conflicts more intense. Tithes, which had long been a source of tension, were now a source of violence. The military, whether parliamentary or ex-royalist, played a significant role in these conflicts, often taking sides and sometimes even taking matters into their own hands. The church, once a place of peace and sanctuary, had become a battleground. The clergy, who were supposed to be peacemakers, found themselves at the center of the storm, sometimes even responding in kind. The years of war had hardened minds, and the potential for violence was always present. The community, once united in faith, was now divided by factionalism and economic hardship. The struggle for power and authority was at the heart of these conflicts, and the church was often the focal point. The events of this period challenged the easy assumption that society quickly bounced back to stability after the civil wars. The scars of war ran deep, and the potential for violence was never far from the surface. The church, the very symbol of order and faith, had become a place of chaos and conflict. The peace that many longed for seemed elusive, and the road to recovery was long and fraught with danger. Margaret Fell was a powerful woman in a time when women were not supposed to have much power. She lived in a place called Swarthmore Hall in the north of England during a period known as the Interregnum, when there was a lot of religious and political change. Margaret and her family converted to a new religious group called the Quakers, and she used her home as a center for their meetings and activities. This made a lot of people, especially men in positions of authority, very upset. Margaret Fell was born into a family of gentlefolk. Her father, John Askew, made sure she was educated, which was unusual for girls at the time. When she was 18, she married Thomas Fell, a judge who was also a member of Parliament. They lived in Swarthmore Hall, a large estate that was a center of farming and economic activity in the area. Margaret had 8 children and was a respected member of the community. She was known for being kind and welcoming, often inviting traveling preachers to her home to discuss their beliefs. In 1652, everything changed for Margaret when she met a man named George Fox. Fox was a Quaker preacher who believed that everyone had an inward light of God within them. When Fox visited Margaret's local church, he stood on a pew and preached about this inner light. His words deeply moved Margaret, and she realized that her previous religious beliefs were not correct. She later wrote, "I saw clearly that we were all wrong, so I sat down in my pew again and cried bitterly." Margaret invited Fox back to Swarthmore Hall, and soon her entire household, including her children and servants, became Quakers. This caused a lot of problems in the community. The local rector, William Lampett, and other important men in the area were angry that Margaret was allowing Quakers to gather at her home. One day, when Fox was preaching in the church, Lampett tried to have him thrown out, but Margaret stood up in her pew and gave the church warden a look that made him back down. Despite this, another local justice, John Sorey, eventually had Fox removed from the church. After this incident, Margaret and her family continued to meet at Swarthmore Hall. The house became a center for Quaker activities, and many people from the area started coming to their meetings. This made the local authorities even more upset. Margaret's husband, Thomas Fell, was often away on business, which meant that Margaret had to deal with a lot of the hostility alone. She stood firm in her beliefs and refused to stop the Quaker meetings, even though it put her and her family in danger. As the years went on, the government passed laws that made it illegal for more than 5 people to gather for non-Anglican worship. This meant that Margaret's Quaker meetings were against the law. In 1664, she was arrested and imprisoned for her activities. Despite this, she continued to support the Quaker movement and even wrote a famous letter to King Charles II, asking him to be more tolerant of religious differences. Margaret's story shows how a woman in a position of power could face a lot of challenges when she decided to follow her conscience. She was not just a mistress of an estate, she was also a leader in a new and controversial religious movement. Her strength and determination helped her navigate the conflicts and challenges she faced, and she became an important figure in the history of the Quakers. Margaret Fell lived in a time when challenging the established order, especially in matters of religion, could lead to serious conflict. When she and her household converted to Quakerism, it was more than just a personal choice. It was a bold statement that shook the foundations of local authority. The local leaders, like Justice Story and Rector Lampett, were powerful men who saw themselves as the guardians of both the church and the state. They were used to being in control, and when Margaret Fell and her family embraced Quaker beliefs, it threatened their power. The Quakers, with their emphasis on personal revelation and the belief that everyone, regardless of gender, could speak directly to God, were seen as dangerous radicals. The local authorities feared that if one prominent household like the Fells could be bewitched by a traveling preacher named George Fox, others might follow, leading to widespread social chaos. When Judge Thomas Fell, Margaret's husband, returned home after being away for 3 weeks, he was met by a group of concerned neighbors, including Rector Lampett. They told him that his wife and children were under the influence of a dangerous preacher, and that the entire household was in ruin. They warned him that if he didn't take action, the whole community could be ruined too. They used the word bewitched deliberately, drawing on the fear of witchcraft that had gripped the region just 20 years earlier. This wasn't just about religious differences, it was about the fear of the unknown and the loss of control. Margaret Fell was aware of the conflict her conversion had caused. She knew that her neighbors, the educated and elite, were spreading rumors about her and her family, suggesting that they were involved in witchcraft. The tension was so high that she and her children withdrew from social activities, isolating themselves from the community. But Margaret was determined to follow her faith, even if it meant facing hostility. When Judge Fell returned, Margaret was faced with a difficult choice. She could either obey her husband and abandon her new faith, or she could stand firm in her beliefs and risk his disapproval. She wrote about her dilemma, saying, "I was struck into such a sadness, I knew not what to do, my husband being from home. I saw it was the truth, and I could not deny. Any may think what a condition I was like to be in, that either I displease my husband or offend God." Despite the pressure, Margaret chose to follow her faith. When she sat down to dinner with her husband, something extraordinary happened. As she described it, the power of the Lord seized upon me, and Judge Fell was struck with amazement. Whatever happened, it was powerful enough to change his mind. He became quiet and still, and from that moment on, he began to accept her beliefs and even allowed Swarthmore Hall to become a center for Quaker meetings and activities. While Judge Fell's tolerance was important, it was Margaret's strong faith and bold actions that truly made the difference. She didn't back down, even when it meant facing social isolation and the disapproval of her neighbors. Her conviction and the divine power she felt were so strong that they influenced her husband and eventually the entire Quaker community. As Quakerism spread throughout England and Scotland, Margaret Fell and Swarthmore Hall became well known. However, this fame also brought criticism and ridicule. Some people, including Cromwellian spies, mocked her and her activities. Margaret, however, was not afraid to speak her mind. She wrote several letters to Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, criticizing him for not protecting Quakers from persecution. She used strong, apocalyptic language to hold him accountable, warning him of the consequences of his actions. One of the most persistent opponents of Margaret Fell was Justice Story. He had tried to prevent George Fox from speaking at the local church, and had even physically attacked Fox and other Quakers. Story continued to spread rumors about the Quakers, accusing them of being in league with the devil. Margaret responded with 3 fierce letters, accusing Story of ignorance and evil. She didn't back down, even when Story tried to physically stop her from speaking to Rector Lampett. She stood her ground and continued to defend her faith and her community. The conflict with local authorities continued, but Margaret Fell's unwavering faith and bold actions made her a powerful figure in the Quaker movement. She used her social status, and her religious conviction to challenge those who tried to silence her. Her story is a testament to the strength of her faith and her determination to follow what she believed was right, even in the face of great opposition. In 1660, the restoration of King Charles II to the throne of England did not bring the peace and protection that Margaret Fell and her fellow Quakers had hoped for. Despite the end of the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, the new king and the Church of England were determined to reassert their authority. This meant more trouble for the Quakers, who refused to take oaths and held their meetings outside the established church. Margaret, a strong and determined woman, used her estate at Swarthmore Hall as a center for Quaker activities. While some local magistrates and gentry, like Colonel West and Justice Anthony Pearson, were sympathetic to the Quakers, others were not. These opponents saw the Quakers as a threat to the newly restored monarchy and church. They increased their harassment, making it harder for Margaret to hold meetings at her estate. Margaret believed that her ultimate allegiance was to Christ, not to any earthly authority. She wrote letters to King Charles II and his brothers, James and Henry, reminding them that Christ taught, "Call no man master upon earth, for ye have one master in heaven." She argued for freedom of conscience, asking the king to protect the Quakers from persecution. In 1661, Margaret took a bold step and traveled to London to meet King Charles II in person. She asked him to prevent the harassment of Quakers and to release those who were in prison. After more than a year, she returned to Swarthmore with good news. The king had agreed to release over 4,000 Quakers from prison. However, during her absence, her eldest daughter, Bridget, faced resistance from local justices who opposed the Quakers' meetings. Bridget, showing the same strength as her mother, refused to stop the meetings. She wrote to her sister that local justices called them rebels and even arrested Quakers, including some from Swarthmore. One of the most persistent opponents was Colonel Richard Kirkby, a royalist who was deeply against the Quakers. Bridget stood firm, telling Kirkby that she would not stop the meetings, even when warned that men were coming to break them up. The conflict continued even after Judge Thomas Fell's death. The Kirkby family, along with Sir Daniel Fleming, a royalist and sheriff of Cumberland, intensified their persecution of the Quakers. Fleming viewed Quaker meetings as a threat and fined Margaret and other Quakers heavily. In 1664, Fleming and Kirkby ransacked Swarthmore Hall, and Margaret was arrested and taken to Lancaster. She was found guilty of refusing to take the oath of allegiance and for holding illegal meeting. The judge offered her a deal: stop the meetings and she wouldn't have to take the oath. Margaret refused, declaring her faith in God over any earthly authority. She was imprisoned in Lancaster Castle for nearly 4 years. Despite her release in 1668, the harassment did not end. In 1669, she was imprisoned again for holding meetings at her house. However, with the help of George Fox and her daughters, she secured her release from King Charles II. She returned to Swarthmore Hall and continued her ministry, while Fox worked to establish Quakerism in London. The local aggression from magistrates gradually decreased over the years. In 1684, at the age of 70, Margaret traveled to London to meet King James II and plead for the protection of religious conscience. James II's response was brief: "Go home, go home." Despite the continued harassment, the king and his council eventually gave a private caution to their persecutors, and the trouble subsided. Margaret's commitment to her faith and her right to worship freely never wavered. In 1697, at the age of 83, she made one last trip to London to meet King William III. She wrote to him about the principles of Quakerism and the importance of religious freedom. By this time, the Quakers were living more comfortably, and their meetings were undisturbed. Margaret Fell's life was a testament to her unwavering faith and her determination to stand up for what she believed in. For nearly 50 years, she fought for her right to use her estate as a center for Quaker activities. She faced opposition from her husband, local authorities, and even the king, but she always remained true to her beliefs. Her legacy as a strong and influential figure in the early Quaker movement continues to inspire people around the world. In the early 16th century, the world was deeply intertwined with the church and its rules. People followed the church's guidelines for everything, including marriage. The church believed that once a couple agreed to marry, they were bound together for life. and breaking that bond was almost impossible. No one could get a divorce as we know it today. If a marriage went wrong, the best they could hope for was to live separately. Marriages were simple to create. All that was needed was for the couple to say words of commitment to each other, and they didn't even need a priest to be present. The tricky part was proving that these words were spoken, especially if someone later challenged the marriage. This is where the church courts came in. They would listen to the couple and any witnesses to decide if the marriage was real. In the Diocese of Lincoln, which is a part of England, we have some old records from the bishop's court. These records show us how people dealt with marriage problems. The court was often busy, and many of the cases involved what we call clandestine marriages. These weren't necessarily secret, but they happened in different places, like someone's home instead of a church. One of the biggest issues was making sure that both people in the marriage agreed freely. The church wanted to make sure no one was forced into a marriage they didn't want. Sometimes a parent or guardian had to give their permission, especially if the person was young. If a condition was added, like getting a parent's approval, the marriage wasn't final until that condition was met. For example, there was a case involving John Floyd and Alice Skewington. John said they were married, but Alice said she agreed only if her father said it was okay. Her father then told the court that he had originally said no, but later changed his mind. This made things very complicated because now both Alice and the man she had married later, John Spence, were in trouble. Another important case involved Thomas Stevenson and Isabel Richards. They made sure to have witnesses when they said their marriage vows. Paul Spencer, a witness, told the court that he heard them repeat their vows, and 2 other witnesses confirmed this. The court then declared them officially married. The church tried to make sure that marriages were done properly, with the right words and the right witnesses. But sometimes, what the church wanted and what people wanted didn't always match. People often had to consider what their families and communities thought, which could make things more difficult. In the end, these old court records give us a glimpse into how people in the early 16th century dealt with marriage problems. They show us that even back then, marriage was a complex and sometimes contentious issue. The church's role was to make sure that marriages were fair and that everyone's rights were respected. But sometimes it was hard to balance the church's rules with what people actually wanted.